All right, we're live. Today I'm talking to my youngest brother, Reuben, a proud, I believe, member of Gen Z. And I just reached out to him because one of my favorite books of all time is The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which discusses how the placement of different generations in positions of power throughout history influences the cycles of history and the pulses of crisis and recovery that drive history forward. And really talks a lot about how we tend to think of time and history as a straight line perpetually moving forward. But in reality, we forget the more ancient notion of time and history, that there are cycles that continually repeat. And the content of those cycles differs as technological and social change happens, but the patterns on a deeper level remain the same and continue to repeat. And different generations occupy different archetypal roles in this historical development, depending on the conditions of the world during their childhood and young adulthood, etc. I've always found the subject of generations to be quite fascinating, and I was telling Reuben before we started recording that The Fourth Turning is one of my favorite books of all time, top 10. And I feel like it has quite a bit of explanatory power. And any time that I find something like that, I tend to latch onto it and kind of store it away on the back burner because I find those kind of things incredibly useful, especially when you're getting an enormous amount of input from news media and conversations with others. It's helpful to have these little frameworks that you can use to understand the people that you're talking to and where they're coming from. So that got me thinking about doing a segment on Generation Z, which would be those born after the year 1994. And I believe it extends somewhere to those born around like 2012, 2013. The official benchmarks for those things are always up for debate, but I kind of consider those in Gen Z to be those who are too young to remember 9/11 happening and are too young to remember a time when there was not internet widely available. Mm-hmm. A time at least before powerful cell phones, iPhones, and widespread Wi-Fi access everywhere. Because there was internet and cell phones when millennials were younger, but they were like dinky 80s looking things that were kind of a novelty. So anyway, I thought Reuben would be an interesting guest to discuss Gen Z. And I think this is another one that is just starting to get on the public stage as its oldest members are hitting their early 20s. And I have noticed quite a bit of stylistic difference between millennials and Gen Z that we can get into. But Reuben, I wanted to start with a quote from The Fourth Turning about what they view the archetype for Gen Z is. And I wondered if you could just give me your thoughts on it, how it lines up with your experience and the experience of those you know. And we can talk about the related things as they come up. But this is what they give as archetype for Gen Z, which fits the artist archetype. So just real quick, they have four different. I'll do a little rundown on each one. They have prophet generation, and that would be a generation like the baby boomers. I'll just quote a little bit from the book. Prophet generation grows up as increasingly indulged post-crisis children. They come of age as narcissistic young crusaders during an awakening. They cultivate principle as moralistic midlifers and emerge as wise elders guiding the next crisis.
Aha!
Already the audience is going to say, okay, boomer on that. Then the next, so in our current turning, the current cycle we're in, the boomers occupy the elder role in society, and they are a prophet generation.
Okay.
The next one is a nomad generation, and this would apply to those who are in Gen X. So that's like the Kurt Cobain generation. Eminem is another one. Ice Cube, just using music references, that era.
Yeah.
The nomad generation grows up as underprotected children during an awakening, comes of age as the alienated young adults of a post-awakening world, mellows into pragmatic midlife leaders during a crisis, and ages into tough post-crisis elders. So looking at Gen X, these would be the kids who grew up during the social chaos of the 70s and 80s, when there was kind of massive adult awakening and exploration.
Kind of like the latchkey kids.
Latchkey kids, is it? Yeah, latchkey kids. They grew up with a lot of adult supervision. The Breakfast Club is kind of an archetypal example of that generation. Kurt Cobain, widespread victims of divorce. Divorce really skyrocketed in the 70s after social norms changed from the 60s. Mm-hmm. And so they grew up feeling underprotected, vulnerable, and kind of hard scrabble kids who had to fend for themselves. Then you have a hero generation who grows up as protected post-awakening children, come to age as heroic team workers in a crisis, and they demonstrate hubris as energetic midlifers and emerge as powerful elders who are attacked by the next prophet generation. So the current turning, that would be millennial. Millennial
okay, yeah.
And in the previous turning, the GI generation would have been a hero generation. So they hit young adulthood as the Depression and World War II.
Yeah.
And then they had massive collective drive to help solve that problem. And then they became the kind of conformist, top-down collectivist leaders of the 50s who were eventually raged against by the prophet generation of the baby boom.
Yeah.
So that is where the role millennials would be filling, according to this theory. And finally, you have an artist generation, which grows up as overprotected children during a crisis. They come of age as sensitive young adults of a post-crisis world. They break free as indecisive midlife leaders during an awakening, and they age into empathic post-awakening leaders. So these would be, in the previous turning in an older generation, this would have been the silent generation. So people in their 80s and 90s now, or late 70s, would be this silent generation. Those who were too young to fight in World War II, so they kind of feel like they missed out on the big, grand, collective mission, but they still were children during a time of a lot of tension, a lot of economic insecurity, and a lot of existential insecurity, as it seemed like the country might literally collapse or that Hitler might win the war and everything would be over. But they couldn't actually do anything to fight the war, and instead resorted to more artistic means of dealing with that. So a lot of those people were kind of the sensitive singer-songwriters of the 60s, like the Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez types. The Beatles would have been in that generation.
Okay.
So that's a lot to throw at you right there, but that just kind of gives you the blueprint for these different archetypes. And Gen Z, just to put it in our current times framework, it would be an artist generation because Gen Z is growing up in the post-2008, after the post-2008 financial crisis, and the crisis era is culminating in the COVID crisis, the January 6th Capitol riots, and the election turmoil, and the general sense of massive division that the country has right now. But Gen Z is too young to really be involved in the front lines of that struggle the way older generations are, who actually occupy positions of political power. So my question to you is, like, if all that is to say, does that idea of being an artistic generation that is overprotected during a crisis and is unable to effectively contribute to the crisis solution, is there a sense of powerlessness or nihilism in Gen Z? Because it does strike me that it's an artistic generation. That label seems to fit. But I haven't lived that experience. So, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, just to preface any of this, I think any of the ideas or opinions I'm going to have are going to be from my personal reflection or from exposure to my immediate social circle and like the people my own age, I think that the kind of generational groupings that you refer to, I think definitely helps with distinguishing, because there are like certainly distinguishing qualities that are present in people, like the cultural landscape and the advancement of technology. The degree to which those things are, I think, does have a very obvious influence on, you know, personalities of the generations that are growing up during them. I think that is really true. But I think putting too much stock into how much or how general you can make those claims about the generational groupings, I think is like, it's kind of like the white girl with astrology. Like it applies to everything, and you know it'll
Right.
never,
Yeah. Right.
you know, it's foolproof. But I think that there are some benefits in thinking about it like that, because you know you got to order your thoughts in some way. So I mean, something that I've thought about in and this is now to your question. I think that two of the things that, well, maybe three, but starting off with two that I think are essential in what kind of has formed the idea of Gen Z or its members, is first the lack of experience, or at least you weren't conscious during 9/11 happening. And then, as you've been saying for a while, like the advancement of technology to the point of having a smartphone from a very young age. So I think having the two of those things are definitely kind of what goes into what shapes the Gen Z mindset up to this point, and the kind of personality. I would say that 9/11 kind of being the last very outward struggle or big issue on American soil, I think really allowed people who were conscious and able to go out and enact a change of some sort at that time. That kind of allowed people to be unified in a way that I think wasn't present for a while. And I think in times of crisis, you definitely have that. In smaller ways, didn't last very long. But at the beginning of COVID, you felt like you were very connected with everyone you saw at the grocery store.
Right.
Or, you know, everyone globally was on the same page and kind of facing the same direction. Didn't last long. Things got politicized. It got ugly. But I think having that for the people who were conscious at the time of 9/11, I think was important. But Gen Z fitting in the bracket that wasn't conscious during 9/11, we've never really had since then something that has very put at the front of our minds. There's a struggle right here in front of you that you need to pay attention to. It's always been this overseas thing that can be kind of dismissed, at least in the minds of someone who isn't really naturally prone to pay attention to something like that. So I think that has allowed a lot more freedom to pursue and indulge in some ways some bad perversions that are definitely kind of pushed by older generations, maybe in an effort to control or whatever. But in a lot of the more progressive agendas, you see that kids are the greatest good that you can achieve as a young person is this act of like breaking all of the societal norms and self-realization about yourself that I don't think anyone really in the formative years, like 14 to 20, 22, I don't think anyone previously had near the same freedom to pursue that. So I think having the freedom and having all of the struggles kind of that can be dismissed as off-sea or offshore kind of, you know, things you can look past, and having the freedom to indulge kind of your you know, idiosyncrasies or kind of perversions in some way has led to everyone being a little more introspective. And I think that you see that in the music that you mentioned a lot coming from Gen Z, like Billie Eilish and Juice WRLD. All of the people that are very popular in that vein have a very melancholic view of the world and kind of what has happened. And I think that when you aren't engaged in some sort of very a very upfront struggle that you can practically put things into action, I think that gives you back positive emotions and a positive self-perception, because you see yourself outwardly accomplishing these things. But without those outward struggles to see yourself accomplishing, I think, and the emphasis being on the turning in, realizing yourself and all what makes you. I think having all of that mixed with not, like I said, having the struggles in front of you, I think contributes to what you see right now. With it's not all bad, and it's certainly not it's not going to cover everyone because everyone's different. But I think the overall sense, I think. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I think that I think is what you're seeing with.
There's a lot of good stuff in there. Because you make an interesting point about not having an existential threat, really, or at least not something that's immediately present the way a war would be.
Mm-hmm.
And not that you ever want war to happen, but there's no question that the threat, that military threat, does tend to streamline a lot of things toward a collective purpose. Not making any judgments on the wider issue of what's going on there, but you can look at a country like Israel, tends to have massive national unity and its very strong sense of identity. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that there is an imminent threat to their
on all sides,
safety on all sides
for
hundreds, thousands of miles. And their biggest ally is on the other side of the world in the U.S. And the fact both that they've been able to preserve themselves for as long as they have, I think, boosts morale. And then it gives you kind of a lineage that you can pass on to younger generations that, you need to continue carrying this torch, because if you don't, this whole thing could be over. So I think that's a really good point, that there's nothing as immediate as that for a younger generation like Gen Z. And you also mentioned the introspection and self-exploration being encouraged by older generations, which is an interesting difference between you guys and the boomer generation, who did engage in a lot of experimentation of all sorts, but it was largely discouraged in the extreme by older generations, and it was a massive act of rebellion to do those things. And it really was risky in a lot of ways to do that at the time. Whereas right now, it seems like the more that you can explore and the more of a unique identity you can cultivate for yourself, especially in terms of image. I mean, there's no question that social media contributes to that you actually have a much bigger, you actually kind of have your own digital canvas to cultivate a literal image of yourself.
Yeah.
The more unique an image you can make of yourself, the more currency you seem to have. That is a big difference.
I think that that's a good point about the social media. And it does sound like it's the most stereotypical, easy answer you can throw at something. Social media. But I think that in a lot of ways, and something that I felt personally, I've definitely, in my life, I've definitely made a good step about limiting, in a lot of ways, social media for a while, and then now being totally off of it, for the occasional Instagram check. But for the most part, I'm off of it. But a lot of people are steeped in this, my own age, a lot of people are steeped in this, across 6 or 7 huge apps. And they spend most of their waking hours either talking about it or thinking about it, what can I do to make my image look better? And if you're steeped in that for long enough, that's going to have a very huge imprint on your psyche and dictates what you do and what you think about. So if the emphasis, and from a young age too, if you're getting that 12 or 13, that's going to make pretty much an indelible mark, I would think, on, your processes, your internal processes. And so if you're always geared towards thinking, how can I get attention, or, hop on a trend, or look better, or look thinner, or look cooler, if you're always doing that on a digital platform, your tendency is going to be from there on to always be trying to, look inside and not even in a meaningful way, just kind of thinking, just glamorizing the sadness you have and I don't really know in what way that would. Maybe we can get into that later if there's like something meaningful in the melancholy that you see kind of pervading a lot of Gen Z thought or whatever. But I think, yeah, that the social media thing, it is kind of an easy answer, kind of a buzz topic. But I think that it's addictive. It is incredibly addictive, and you just keep scrolling. And if you get that from a young age, it's going to leave a lot of marks on like the behavior that will carry through your life. I think that's
and really, even though it is something that gets over discussed on the one hand, maybe it's something that really isn't over discussed because it simply is incredibly powerful, and it's still so new. It's really kind of an open question what the long-term effect will be.
No one knows,
everyone, let alone little kids who are growing up with it, 5 years old, and they're already, using TikTok and Snapchat and whatever else. And the technology will inevitably advance substantially over the course of just their childhood. It's still an open question what that effect is going to be. So it is powerful, and I think people forget. It seems like it's always been with us, but it's really only been about, 10, 15 years that it's been around. I got Facebook in 2006.
Not even that.
Well, social media has been around because I got Facebook in 2007 and MySpace.
Really?
Yeah, 2007.
Wow. Okay.
Or maybe 2008, one of those 2 years.
Wow.
And that's when it was still very new. You had to belong to a university. So I put in some fake university to get an account. You still had to belong to a college. It was a college thing. And MySpace had been around for a year or two before that. So like social media existed. But even then, it was something you had to go to a desktop computer and intentionally do. It didn't have
exactly.
It didn't essentially pervade the atmosphere of everywhere you were was the material of social media potentially. I feel like that's really only the last 5 to 10 years, if that.
Probably 2013 or 14 is when I think that it became this. Well, smartphones became sophisticated, and with that, the social media platforms as well.
Yeah. Well, what do you like? Why do you think? Let's see, where could we go? What do you think the motivation is for that endless crafting of image? Is it for yourself? Is it for other people? In your experience, where does that compulsion come from? Because the common view is that you're trying to prove to other people that your life is worthwhile somehow, that you're unique enough, that you are special enough that you will be remembered somehow by time, and you won't just fade away. And that's kind of the pseudo-philosophical way of looking at it, which I think there's a lot to it. But do you think that there's anything else to it? Is that a theory from an older generation that isn't seeing it from the inside the way that younger people are? What other reasons come to mind as what compels that crafting of image?
I think that there are some motivations that I think are present in Gen Z that I think are peculiar or particular to Gen Z. But I think that, at the risk of sounding douchey, it is kind of just the human condition being played out, and just, as Gen Z, you have these tools that no one ever in history, the incredible ability to connect to anyone at any time, anywhere, like that, unprecedented. And so your natural human condition is gonna, be exacerbated if you have that.
It brings to mind like in ancient history, the impulse was clearly still there, but you pretty much had to be a king or an emperor to truly indulge it.
Yeah.
To marshal the resources to build massive statues of yourself. Or, I don't know, have you ever read the poem Ozymandias?
No.
Oh, okay. It's a famous poem. You should look it up. It's a famous poem where the author is describing a trip to what sounds like Egypt, and he finds a set of rubble, and it turns out to be these ancient ruins with like half a face of a big statue that's buried in sand. And he goes up there and he finds an inscription that says something like, "I am Ozymandias, the king of kings. Look on my works and despair." And then he talks about all around the ground lies bare, and the lonely sand stretches far away. Which is a great poem. I think it pretty much is the ultimate ego check. You read that poem and you're like, yeah, that's what we're all doing. That's what it all comes to.
Yeah, and
humility. But you had to be an emperor. You had to be Ozymandias. You had to be a pharaoh to really do that. Now everybody has the power to try to carve themselves into time that way and make themselves stand out and try to last that way. So you're right. It's a lot of power to have at your fingertips that previously only the king had.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was kind of just that unattainable, goal that is just the most natural inclination you can have as a human is, you look around you and you see things as everything around you is ephemeral and passing, and so are you.
Yeah.
But there's something in you that's like, what is the thing? I need to last. There's something. So that is obviously present in the human condition, by nature. But I think that it could be what is responsible for the mad scramble of the social media influencers and these people that are really trying to be famous at really whatever costs and by whatever means. It's weird. And I think that is just having that much power, and really it's only just a matter of effort. You see people that if you put in enough effort and you really, you got to get lucky and there's other circumstances, but there's not really anything like you're not a serf and it's not like you don't have any chance ever to get into the palace, or like you could and you could become famous through this. And so having that is just kind of like, what am I doing? I should be trying to do that. And something that I've thought a lot about is when you think about TikTok, I think Vine was more a kind of a funny comedic, but I think that was more identified with the millennial generation.
Definitely.
And I think TikTok is more of the Gen Z's kind of version of that. But aside from me thinking that is like the most worthless use of your time you could ever engage in, I think that I keep going back and forth on whether I think that the 16 to 20-year-olds who become like almost invasively famous off TikTok, whether it's they're not given enough credit for the way they've done what they in TikTok, the way they've kind of cornered a certain market, and then they were able to make it public and bring in an audience, and then be smart by getting endorsements and start making money for themselves. I keep going back and forth on whether I think that, these people my age should get more credit for how they're savvy in that way, or if, they're just attractive and you just need a very rudimentary sense of marketing and then you're on the top. You probably need a bit of both, but I keep going back and forth on that. And I don't know. I think that people should be given, there are good things you could have out of, and I always think social media is a tool, and I think that it has some more negative effects than I think positive sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. You can use it for a good thing. But just to kind of bring it back, I think that there are some particular reasons, I guess, and motivations that Gen Z has in regards to social media and why it is this really ever-present, omnipotent thing, pretty much. And then there's also just the universal human condition that is present in Gen Z, having these abilities at this age and having that inclination to, last and to become famous and to really feel like from the public's adulation to derive your own self-worth. So for the particular reasons, I think that something we mentioned earlier was the ability or not having a crisis on American soil and not really being faced with that outward struggle. I think that, this is kind of a buzz phrase, but I think that there is older generations that like to push certain agendas on Gen Z in order, to get, because they're the biggest demographic in the social media marketplace, and they push really, and you can cancel someone's career using these kids if you just fill them up with the right amount of propaganda and kind of your own set of ideas. You can use them as a very, very powerful force to, bring down your opponents or whatever. So I think that there is a lot of, pushing of agendas on Gen Z through be it teachers or adults that, significant figures, adult figures in these kids' lives, that they're getting pushed on that. And I think that there's like this false sense of, it's the social justice warrior kind of person where they feel like using these powers that they have, and it's the whole virtue signaling thing as well. Is like, I am going to take a stand on Twitter for something going on in the news right now, and feeling like from there as well, seeing that you have this reaction to this thing, they will think something about you, and you will garner worth from that, having that public perception of that. So I think it's kind of, people naturally want to be seen as these caring, good people first. And I think from the agendas that have been pushed on them, they're programmed with a set of ideals. And this is, again, not, universal. This is just kind of what I've experienced with some people my own age. They're kind of programmed with a set of ideals, and then with the tools that they have, and being savvy on social media, they kind of make that known and like really bash down any other ideas that come to oppose it. And then from there, you can kind of feel like you're doing something very worthwhile with your life without actually putting in any effort. And I think,
that's a really interesting point. That was actually something I was going to ask about, like the weaponization of the generation, considering the social media influence that they have. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it seems like an obvious connection to what you've said previously about there not being an existential threat on American soil, and there not really being a war to fight in the literal sense. But there certainly seems to be wars to fight if you're willing to wage them on social media. And it seems like a generation of prophets, like the boomers, would welcome a young generation with so much power in the realm of ideas. And it sounds like that could be appealing to a generation that doesn't feel like they are playing a part in solving the physical existential threats.
Yeah, I think that's...
And COVID, I definitely don't want to make this about COVID, but COVID is, it is involved in this generational story, because that's kind of the apex of this crisis here. But even that isn't something you feel like you can do all that much about, other than stay home and say things online. And
right there, yeah. With COVID, there's something that I noticed early on, and it definitely kind of shaped a lot of things about the way I view the world in general now, from experiencing that. I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, soon will be. When that first happened, it's such a weird event to experience, because it's global. And like I said previously, you feel that connection with every stranger you see, be it in the grocery store or if they live in Bangladesh. You're all kind of facing the same thing. But there's really no one to direct your anger, frustration, or fear at. Yeah. And so you start choosing targets like, and obviously we don't want to get into this, but for this example, you kind of start to, it was the Chinese, they released it, or Bill Gates has this massive scheme to enslave the world by selling the vaccine. Like humans want to see, they want to have an object to throw their tomatoes at. And so I think that when there wasn't one and people were at their screens all day, I think that was a very bad combination that resulted in, I think, more of a fracturing among a lot of people than could have happened. What I thought was going to happen or result from that time of isolation and everyone kind of in the same boat, I thought there was going to be a lot more unity. And I think at some smaller grassroots level, I think there is And I definitely am not like a fatalist. I don't think, I try not to watch the news really at all, or mainstream networks at all, because and again, not to get into this either, there's so many things, but I think that they really want you to see some sort of negative view of the world. But I think you just have to talk to, individuals, or go to more, the reputable stuff, because I don't think people, and especially Gen Z, I don't think that, like, it is the natural human inclination, like you said, there's no war.
Yeah.
But there's still, you want to go out and you want to do something better. That's natural. And so I think when this came around, no one wanted to sit inside and just be like, well, there's no one to blame, so got to move on. They chose something, and if you've already been set with a briefcase of ideals, you're going to start to pick from there and start to, target people. And I think that, it's dangerous when you get people who have been caught at an early age, like I think a lot of Gen Z has in high schools, where certain agendas have been pushed on them, and they hold the reins for the most part to social media, which is responsible for so much, like, career destructions of people, or just reputations
or
totally tainted.
Career launchings.
Yeah, exactly. Like, TikTok fame, music, all of these things. Like, it is a tool, but I think that in the hands of people who I think are a result of a lot of push propaganda, I think that is kind of the result you see for the most part. Definitely not on the whole, but for the most part.
It makes me wonder if, as Gen Z gets older, if that power will mature, if more responsibility will emerge, if as they grow up and they enter the world, as we call it, more and more, I wonder if that power will start to become used in a more channeled fashion. I wonder if some of what you see with the bashing and the 15 minutes of hate and the canceling, I wonder if some of that will die down and be used more effectively. Because again, to kind of reference the fourth turning, after a crisis period, which is what we're in according to this theory, and it certainly feels that way, the next period is a high period in which there is a much stronger sense of unity, a much stronger sense of purpose, and a streamlining and a simplifying of all levels of society. So think about an era like the Roaring '20s and going into the Great Depression. There were a lot of different voices. There was a strong progressive movement at that time too, with like William Jennings Bryan, and there was a socialist party at the time. Communism, there was a Red Scare in, I think, maybe like the early 1900s, and that was always a scare. The Roaring '20s was a chaotic time of expansion. The '30s was a huge time of economic deprivation, the worst the country's had. I guess you could argue ever, at least as far as acute economic deprivation. And it wasn't really until, and it didn't seem like leadership effectively solved any of those problems. For instance, Herbert Hoover was an extremely unpopular president who tried to deal with the Depression. And you can debate whether he had good intentions or good ideas or not, but the fact was that the public didn't perceive it that way. He was more or less run out of town on a rail in favor of FDR, who then he was elected to 4 terms and served 3 full terms, which is illegal now, but it would still be kind of unimaginable for any candidate I can think of that long. And that stabilized things, and that whatever you think of him, he was able to rally everyone behind a particular collective vision. He simplified the discourse. There weren't all these voices. There wasn't so much chaos. Things were streamlined. And then there was a war, too, which streamlined economic production, too. So everything just got much simpler, much more simple. And then that led to the high era of the 50s with massive economic booms and military victories, etc. So if this theory holds, we'll come up with something like that in the post-crisis, the post-COVID era, and it would be a lot to get into to think about particular things that might happen. But it's interesting for me to think about what role Gen Z might play in that, considering the power they have in the realm of at least propagating ideas. Especially meme type of ideas, short, little, effective ideas that spread very easily and can be extremely powerful for good or evil. I wonder if you think this, if that's something that Gen Z will mature into as being especially effective at negotiating or mediating between aging millennials as millennials start getting into positions of higher and higher political leadership and whatever generations come next in terms of helping manage that marketplace of ideas. Because I do see already it's a bit of an interesting time right at this moment in July 2021. Because at least in America, it seems like COVID is dying down as at least a defining issue. I think it'll still be around for a while, but it's not like what it was last year.
Yeah.
And not a subject to get into really at all, but just stating a fact that, Trump is gone for the moment. So the lightning rod between right and left that he was is also gone as a target and as a lightning rod. So with those two things gone, it's kind of interesting to me to think about kind of what is gonna be next. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on like what role Gen Z might play going forward. I know that's a lot, but
yeah, I mean, I like to be. I've learned that there really is no use in being negative about the future or current situations. I think that you always need to be trying to see that there are positives always to see, and that you need to kind of fan the flame of those. And there's really no use in being a fatalist. That's definitely something I've encountered a lot over the past year, as I'm sure you have with, just people that enjoy being miserable or enjoy being sad about the world or bemoaning all of these things. Like there is kind of a fashionable negativity these days. But to kind of, these are the two concerns that I have going forward for Gen Z based on what I've seen and kind of what you were saying about the stabilizing nature of Roosevelt.
Which I think, if you look, for better or worse, I think Biden at least sees himself in that role. He's a new FDR, I think, is what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I mean
that's how when he somebody I think it might have been Mitch McConnell said, when he looks in the mirror, he sees FDR now. Yeah, but I think it's probably true, and maybe he'll be successful, maybe not. But that's kind of the role that he was elected to fit.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even think about too much at the political, like the highest. Yeah, political
we don't need to talk about Biden, but just like to move on to the Roosevelt.
No, but so first, like the first concern I have is that you were talking about at that time, his the stabilizing nature of that. And he kind of brought balance back to things, and the economy started to soar again. I think that the concern I have is that I don't see social media going away, and I don't see there being an EMP anytime soon as well. Okay. So, electromagnetic, like the thing that just in those movies that shatters. Social media will be here for a little.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
It will be here for a while. Yeah. And I think that you were talking about how discourse kind of became unified again, or at least ordered in such a way that it was productive of good and practical answers to things. And something you talk about a lot is when you look back at university lectures and you see how, even though, and this is again for the most part there are exceptions, but for the most part, the students that were present at these lectures vehemently disagreed with the speakers, but there was still kind of this this good discourse going on that they were actually trying to reconcile answers, or at least not just drown out the other person with noise, which is the luxury that social media affords you. If you get millions and millions of people to just shit on this other person, And then how could that person ever get out of that huge wave? That's that thing. So I think discourse is the common discourse of the day, I think, is so fractured and just everywhere, and can be controlled by any bloke at their keyboard. I think that's a huge difference between the time that FDR came in and stabilized things to the time we're in now, is that you can't control the discourse going on. You kind of just have to put out what you can and then hope people react well to that. Right. So that's the doubt I have going forward, that discourse will ever be unified again to the degree that it was back then. And the second concern I have is that are you kind of familiar with Jake or Logan Paul?
No.
Okay. Well, a brief they came up. I'm sorry.
Give me a brief rundown. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very brief, and they're kind of my quintessential picture of douchebags. But they kind of grew up as littler kids, 12 or 13 in the Vine age, so they were really young starting off. And I thought with a lot of them that a lot of the Vine people that they would just drift off into the unknown and no one would hear from them again. But they were able to jump onto the next app that was popular and really keep themselves. And they just kind of got their fame off of being annoying, kind of prankster white guys who would go around and do dumb stuff, or that was just kind of the image they cultivated. And then these days they're the biggest thing on the internet, and Logan Paul just he's a YouTuber, and he just fought Floyd Mayweather in this exhibition match. Yeah, so that's the exemplifies the influence that you have, this dumb kind of he's athletic, he's a big dude, but this YouTuber guy was able to have a match with Floyd Mayweather just through
what happened? He get knocked? It couldn't have been.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of speculation about if it was there, if Floyd just held back to keep the fight going. Anyway,
okay. Yeah.
And then Jake, his younger brother, is just kind of in the same vein, and they just do the same stuff, and they're kind of just dumb and very adolescent people, but they're glorified. They're the biggest thing on social media or the internet. And the concern I have for Gen Z going forward is the glorification of prolonged adolescence. That there's these people that they're famous and they're living in mansions and they're driving Raris and all of these things, and that is kind of what everyone's shooting for now. It's all I need to do is just grind on TikTok or grind on Instagram, and I'm going to make it there. But you mimic the behavior and the images.
I was going to say, I feel like that's kind of one of the negative stereotypes that I definitely see with Gen Z, is the idea of being a YouTuber as a lifestyle aspiration.
Yes, exactly.
It's kind of a bizarre thing to aspire to. Well, and even more surprising to me was when my old boss's son, who was incredibly annoying as a kid. I only met him a few times, but I remember talking to one of my old coworkers, and she was saying "Oh, so and so moved out to Hollywood and he's a YouTuber now." And I was and she's yeah, and he has thousands and thousands of followers, and he's making money doing it. And I was are you kidding me? And I looked it up, and it was, I mean, like you said, it was literally just walking around and just obscenely annoying people who were trying to go about their day. And the reactions weren't really even funny. It was a lot of people just being dude, please, can you please just leave me alone? What do you want? I'm just trying to have a conversation here. And then it was thousands and thousands of views and all these comments. And it was this is a job. That's a really, that's a really troubling thing that is a job, and that is a lifestyle aspiration. And I guess every generation has their things like that. But to me, that seems the dark side of having so much power.
Exactly. I mean, even just something that happened at my work the other day, which got me thinking about this exact thing, was this dude who was dressed very oddly, and I was sitting by the drive-through window, and this guy swings it open from the outside, and he kind of throws half of himself in the window. He's like, "Oh, you got me!" Like, he just starts making an ass of himself, and I'm like, "Dude, get out!" And then this guy's filming him, and then they come in, and he like starts getting on the counter and just doing dumb shit, and we're all just like, "What are you doing?" And this guy's filming him the whole time. And they leave, and I'm like you this, and then while I was talking to one of the coworkers, and she, well, I was talking to one of my coworkers, and she was like, "Oh yeah, he lives in St. Louis. He's super big right now." I'm like, and that's what he does. Like, there's literally no admirable quality in that. You were just an ass, being obnoxious and interrupting everyone's life. And like that, and when you see that they're successful, that's what I think is the worst part, because people want to do that. It seems a lot more of an enjoyable path to being rich and famous than like perfecting a craft, So,
and it also is a weird feeling to know that like at any moment you might like become a character in somebody's viral YouTube video.
That's what I thought was going to happen. I was standing right there. I was getting filmed. I was like I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to sit here, because you never know. And
all the world is a stage at this point. I think that's
very true.
I guess to me it seems like success or failure, as much as you can put it that way, for Gen Z will kind of depend on how much you guys grow in the responsibility towards using that power. Because really Gen Z is the first generation of what would it be? I mean, millennials sort of share this, but Gen Z is the first generation of digital natives. And so there is going to be a leg up that Gen Z has over every other generation, simply because they've been involved in the digital world and social media, from the cradle, from kindergarten, like they're aware of it. Millennials came to it in, college or high school for the most part, and it wasn't a part of our childhoods. So that is an immense amount of power, considering that digital currency really is the currency right now. And so if you have the facility that you can only have from doing something from a very young age, is going to be great power. So to me, it kind of seems like developing the responsibility to use that to try to mediate between older generations. But I also wonder if older generations, as they die off, or at least leave positions of power, if Gen Z will develop more of its own sense of ideals and will be less influenced by elders, which could be a good thing.
That's the hope I have. And I mean, I've always I've always said that Gen Z will be will show the long-term effects of both vaping and digital acquaintance from, like you said, the cradle. You'll see both, and you'll see the first signs of both. And so, I think that technology has a big role to play, and I think that it's kind of like the oversimple. Like, if you look at news outlets, they have to, like the big ones like Fox or CNN, they have to simplify everything down, because they're making their audience is hopefully as big as it possibly could be. So to ensure that, you have to simplify everything down to like seemingly black and white things, like very oversimplifications, to get it out there and to be understood and intelligible to the vast majority of people. So when you have that, I think that, the overall sense about what Gen Z is right now, and I'm sure in a lot of ways, millennials kind of got flack for this as well, and still do in a lot of ways, is that there's just the bemoaning of, oh, they're not doing anything, and they're on social media all the time.
I feel like millennials were kind of the big disappointment for boomers. Like, we were supposed to be the foot soldiers to execute their vision, and I think kind of just weren't interested in it, especially losing so much earning power and so many productive years in the recession. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge part of the millennial experience, is that graduating college during the recession feeling, and this kind of despair about attaining that white picket fence American dream. And things have gotten better, and more millennials are buying houses, but people talk all the time about how little millennials own, how few assets we have compared to older generations. And I think really that kind of caused the collective generation to really lose any interest in listening to boomers, who sat on a pile of assets that was much larger than any millennial can reasonably hope to have, unless you become famous or some incredibly successful person, but not an average person. But it seems to me like Gen Z is kind of, boomers see that as kind of, oh, this is what we were waiting for. These are the ones who are going to be able to execute the vision.
Yeah, I think
all those articles bagging on millennials is it was kind of a disappointment that we weren't in.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of what you said in some ways is true. I think that the oversimplification process is very present in just referring to boomers as this homogenous whole and millennials. Like, I think that the vast array of, like, the huge array of people my own age or close to it who would fall in the Gen Z is so varying that, it's really hard to pinpoint if there are, particular very universal traits that are results from the landscape, both technologically and culturally, we grew up in. I think there are some. I think definitely it's undeniable technology will have a huge role to play as you see the long-term effects of that on the psyche. I think most of these problems, and this sounds really like hippie or something, but I think just engaging in individual discourse is always going to help you have a better understanding than any, Twitter war. And obviously that's not what you're talking about, but like, I think the more you bring it down to an individual level, or you can face-to-face talk to people, I think that's when you come to understandings, and instead of placing things in boxes, because that's so easy to do. And then there's really no one to refute you because you're referring to just this massive group of people and this massive group of people. And it's really hard to actually have a discourse without denying someone's credibility on that. But if you're talking face-to-face with someone, or just a group of people that you rotate through, that's when you actually are going to come to an understanding. So I get the reasons for the generational, like, nomenclature, that kind of stuff. But, I think that at the end of the day, things are a lot less, tragic than I think people like to paint them as. And I think Gen Z has a lot that they're going to be doing. And I think, my hopes are high, because I think that, they're not being channeled, I think, generally through the right outlets right now. But I think the creative energy and power that Gen Z has is entirely unprecedented through human history. Like we were saying at the beginning of the podcast, I think that, with the tools we've been given, and kind of like, the first ways we were influenced to use them, I think will have a lasting effect as well, like in what people believe or hold as their ideals from the past generations. But I think, I don't know, I'm positive about that. There's going to be an awakening of some sort, ideologically, or even just, in smaller ways. It's going to contribute to a generation that really has the potential to change the world. Like, it's overused, but it certainly will, for better or for worse. It's gonna be changed in the next 40 years or so.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. That kind of brings me into kind of maybe one more thing to get into before we wrap up, that I want to talk to you about, because I know you're a music fan and you mentioned the power of creativity. There's some striking differences on the one hand between millennial pop stars and Gen Z pop stars that jump out to me immediately. And I think that says a lot about, again, you're talking about generic, all-encompassing labels when you're talking about generations. But I do think you can tell something about people by the individuals that people of a certain age group idolize. And they do seem to be very different. And the other interesting thing about Gen Z is it seems just the literal creative power that is available in terms of, because I've recently gotten much more into like digital music production over the last year and a half, especially with COVID. And I've just been blown away at how widely available and cheap everything you need is.
Yeah.
And for instance, that first Billie Eilish album was, granted they worked on it extensively together for years, but that was all recorded in a bedroom with just equipment that her brother taught himself how to use. And I recall seeing an interview with them one time where he was saying, the whole setup was maybe like $3,000, which is still money, but you could spend $3,000 for a few days of recording at a nice studio.
Yeah.
And you can do it for far cheaper. I think a lot of hip hop and pop instrumentals, the beats are made just on MacBooks with a couple monitors, and you can just download plugins for like $10-$20, and you can make a pop hit. Like What's Poppin', that Jack Harlow song was just made on a MacBook. Like
Fire.
But it's a banger. Yeah, there's no question. So it does seem to me like there's never been more powerful tools at anybody's fingertips. It's very democratized.
Yeah.
So like Gen Z really is just sliding right into that wave. And so that's one thing we could talk about. And another is, I think, like maybe looking at the differences between, guys like Juice WRLD, Post Malone, Billie Eilish, and millennial stars like Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, Blink-182, or like I kind of think of this, the iconic millennial song, at least that I remember, as a pop hit, was that I Throw My Hands Up in the Air Sometimes, the Tayo Cruz song. Dynamite, yes, Dynamite. See, I remember I Throw My Hands Up in the Air Sometimes. I feel like that's kind of like the millennial songs, like we're all here, we're a team, like we're Power Rangers. That's the way they describe it in The Fourth Turning. Like everybody's like, we're here and we're having a good time and we're just going to dance until the world ends or whatever. And when you listen to Gen Z pop, it's almost always a very introspective, the lyrics at least are very introspective and almost universally talking about their own personal pain and personal struggles. And just the tone of the music is radically different too. Millennial pop is much more just like, it's straight, it's upbeat. There's a lot of creative synth stuff, but it's always just that kind of four on the floor pulse. And I feel like Gen Z music is much more dreamy. It's much more sad. It's more syrupy, to use the hip hop term. It's always like drenched in a lot of reverb and a lot of string effects. And there's lots of ghostly voice in the background. And it's just a strikingly different tone. So I don't know. That's just kind of some stuff, like you can kind of pick what you want out of there. But like, does anything strike you about, I think musically, especially Gen Z, will be a very powerful generation, the same way that the last artist generation was in the 60s and 70s, as kind of being those folk singers that started the revolution and were kind of there playing guitar on the streets during the Summer of Love that the boomers arrived for in San Francisco. It's kind of it's that same idea, except there's so much more power.
Yeah, I mean, so from music, I mean, obviously the ability, the one that comes to mind, Post was Post Malone was a SoundCloud overnight sensation. Like he just made that, he moved to California from Dallas, and he made that White Iverson song.
I always think it's really funny,
which is
Dallas.
Yeah, exactly. But he moved to Hollywood with nothing in his pocket and made White Iverson in his bedroom, and then released it on SoundCloud. In like 48 hours, it had millions and millions of views, and everyone was seeing it. And that was just the farthest thing from possible 20, 30 years ago, where you had to go through, you got to get really lucky by being seen by like an exec or something, and then the record label had to like sign off on your sound, or maybe they wanted you to sound a certain way. So I think that the total creative freedom that you have to make whatever you want with, like, the little songs I've made is just on an app and using the Apple earbuds, and that's free. Like that is totally free, and so you can record that and then put that on SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever, and then just push it on your social media platforms, and people catch fire like that. So I think that the creative freedom that affords you, I think, is unheard of.
It also is, I think, a real blessing that Gen Z has, that like these days you don't have to sell out to become big. Like,
no,
it used to be that you would maybe get fairly successful as an indie artist, but if you wanted to make real money, you had to change your sound according to what execs thought would be something that would sell. And then you might do it, and maybe you were successful in the mainstream and you made a lot of money, but you would lose all your original fans and you'd become just like everybody else. But now I feel like you can get famous for doing what you do on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and you don't have to sell out, really. Your own authentic music, if it's good, can succeed and you can become rich and famous and not have that conflict about selling out.
Yeah, I mean, for music, I think that the biggest shift you see, or at least I've personally seen, is that radio doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
Like that used to, like, I can't remember the last time I ever like tuned into, a top 40 radio, really, unless it was like in a lobby somewhere or something. But like, you have your own personal playlist and you just click that, everywhere you go with like Apple Music or whatever. So before, like you were saying, you kind of had to become a little more commercial with your sound and kind of like bring it down to like, where the stations wanted it to be. And so to do that and to really like pursue success that way, you had to modify it to fit that. And so you kind of came out with more of a very common sound to the music, like a Katy Perry or Taylor Swift or things like that, like more millennial associated pop artists who had, who were good. I thought they're solid pop artists, but they had similar sounds with everything. And it was more upbeat, kind of more party oriented, because it had to kind of fit that mold to become successful. Now, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Music, all of these streaming platforms, you can put it out, people listen to it, and you don't even need radio, and it is totally bypassed. So I think that the fact that people don't have to, fit that mold of the radio, which is like upbeat and clean, that kind of, thing that they want to cultivate on the top 40 radios, by bypassing that, you can be more real, like I guess real, and, no radio stations. Like if you think of someone like Billie Eilish, she's played on the radio now just because radios feel like, oh shoot, we got to like play what's popular. But something like Billie Eilish was never, that kind of thing was never played.
No,
back,
she didn't break on the radio.
No, exactly. But like that kind of vein of music was you never heard that on like top 40 radio like 10 years ago.
It's a very strange sound, and it is catchy, like it is poppy, but it's not the kind of thing that like an A&R person would have said like, oh yeah, that's what we want. No,
not like you were saying, Dynamite is the perfect top 40 song.
What that? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that song. That's I think one of the, it's an amazing pop song, but it fit that mold really, really well. Like
it just
pretty clean pop party song that everyone could just jam to. But something like Billie Eilish or some other
Juice WRLD,
just kind of the Gen Z artists who talk more about like their depression or feeling inadequate or mental health problems, like those weren't, you never heard songs that touched on those things back in the day. But I think the freedom that the streaming platforms give you is to be able to talk about that and to be more real and not sell out, like you were saying. So I think that contributes. I think people might have always have felt as melancholic or introspective in their music. They just, and you did have people like that, like Elliott Smith.
I was just going to say Elliott Smith comes.
People like that.
Rocky Votolato, have you ever heard of him?
No.
He was like Elliott Smith. He did a really good album called Makers that I liked, which was
but you always had those people, but they were indie and they stayed indie. Yeah. They never broke.
They never really made much money.
No, so I think people have always felt like that in a way, but now that you can say what you mean or just kind of bask in your own self-pity, which is a fun thing to do occasionally, and make music about it, then you can put that on a streaming platform and not even have to change your sound to fit that radio mold, which I think radio is kind of the crux that has been bypassed, and you can just, do what you want now. So
I think that makes it, I think that puts Gen Z in a really interesting artistic position with respect to the next generation after them, because that generation is going to be kids growing up absorbing Gen Z music and will be even more adept digital natives, presumably. Barring an EMP, as you referenced earlier. And so just like the silent generation singer-songwriters in the 70s, I feel like they could very much influence the sensibilities of the next prophet generation, the next generation to kind of rage against whatever system is established in this post-COVID era eventually. And I think that's a very powerful role in a lot of ways, that it's not the same as fighting a war, but I wouldn't want to just downplay that the way some might and just say, look, if you're not fighting in a war, then, you're not really doing it. You're just inheriting, what we did. And in some sense, that's true.
I love how that's like that's the voice of any boomer ever when you're describing it.
Oh, that's
that voice you go into. Anyway, sorry.
That's my boomer voice. Yeah. What was I going to say? But yeah, I was going to quote. I think I sent you this when we were talking about it earlier. The quote from the book of, from Joshua in the Bible, where he's talking to the first generation that becomes the judges, who kind of has to administer the state that Joshua and his men win. And he says, he calls them inheritor youths, and he reminds them that they enjoy land for which ye did not labor, and cities which ye built not. And that's kind of the voice of that maybe GI type of generation. We won the battles, we established the order and the safety that you enjoy, and you're just inheriting this, and you're lucky that you're getting it. You didn't fight for it. And in one sense, yeah, that's true, but that's an accident of history. But I would never want to downplay the influence that an artistic generation can have on pushing things forward, because that's what kind of forms the mental furniture of those below them and the ideals that they have. And I think that's why, again, I feel like if they go the right way, I feel like Gen Z could be very influential in the realm of ideas and defining what is seen as right and wrong and worth pursuing for future generations. And I think music is a particularly powerful medium, and Gen Z's, I feel like, has a lock on musical power for quite some time.
I think so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably good. I really enjoyed talking about that. There's a lot more we could say, obviously. But I think that was illuminating. I hope that was illuminating for you too. I appreciate it.
It's good. I mean, in leading up, I found that in just kind of the preliminary questions that you sent to kind of start mulling it over and start thinking about different things, I enjoyed, again, like, my stance is that it isn't like these just groups you can have that you can say whatever about. But I think it's beneficial to think about, at least for me, my generation as a whole, and kind of what the circumstances are that have resulted in what you see today. I think that, it's good for any generation to do that. And I definitely, in the future, I do have to read The Fourth Turning, because that does sound like it gives a lot of insight into that kind of thing. But I think that, I think you should always be aware of what took place that is responsible for where you are today. And especially as a generation, you need to know have an idea of where you're going. And at the risk of sounding cliche, to do that, you have to know where you came from and what circumstances were there. So yeah, I enjoyed prepping for this and talking about this. So yeah, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you taking the time. We'll talk again soon.
Yeah. All right. See ya.
All right, take care.